I'm doing kind of an unscripted video here that's impromptu, so bear with me. I just watching the news and thinking about it has really made me feel the urge to talk about Hurricane Helene. So hopefully folks have been following the news, and if I use this in future years, this is dated, I'm sorry, but this is a hot take approximately a week after Hurricane Helene hit the coast of Florida 2024 and did extensive damage up through Florida into, in particular, Tennessee and western North Carolina. And I want to, so some of what I'm going to say is going to maybe come across as a bit harsh. It's not meant in that sense. It's probably some of the emotion that will enter my words comes from a sense of frustration. And it's a sense of frustration that comes from the fact that my generation has done such an incredibly shitty job on climate change. The older generation as well, but my generation, I sit right at the cusp of boomers and Gen Z. I was born in December, right before the transition, so I call myself Gen Z. I think I have the Gen Z attitude. Not Gen Z, I'm sorry, Gen X. My generation has neglected to deal with climate change, and that's just a terrible legacy. So I'm going to talk a little about Hurricane Helene, and what I want to say first off is everything that's happening was predicted, all of it, every single thing. There are elements and aspects that sometimes like, oh, I didn't expect that to happen. When we had the big freeze in Texas several years ago that killed so many people, that one caught me by surprise because I was always focused on flooding and fire and sea rise and things like that. I hadn't thought about the polar vortex and that. So, but people who've been teaching and talking about climate change for years have always emphasized the chaos of it, and that all these systems were going to be disrupted. And so, for example, in the case of Hurricane Helene, we always knew that the increasing air temperature globally increases the amount of moisture the atmosphere can hold, which then generates more snow and more rain, right? Which we're seeing here too, right? So, and so the projections were always for more precipitation and more flooding events, right? And I've been teaching climate change since roughly 2006, and I will flag for you that when I first started teaching climate change, the people that argued with me were students, yes, parents would contact me, administrators, deans and provosts, but also faculty, right? Colleagues in the history department, like, this is a bunch of liberal crap, blah, blah, blah. So, and I have been involved in so many efforts to try to build programs to address climate change, and is just, the litany of failures I've experienced. I talked about my successes when I introduced myself, but like Sam Houston State in East Texas, where I taught climate change, we try to get the president and provost to sign on to the Climate Change Commitment Initiative for University College presidents. What we got was a 2-day-a-week recycling program, which, just think about that. I was called a socialist for wanting recycling. And at the next university I was at, University Incarnate Word, we just, again, what about recycling? What about recycling? Which you all, being highly advanced when it comes to these issues, know that recycling was run out by companies like ExxonMobil as a deflection away from actual meaningful change, and particularly in regards to regulation, research, and taxation, and repurposing of dollars to alternative energy resources. They're like, no, recycle, that'll take care of it. So all of this was predicted. And so the thing that made me think I'm going to do a short hot take video was scrolling through, lurking and reading comments, and people are posting stuff on social media, Facebook, right? I'm older, so Facebook for me. And then someone will say climate change, and I'm like, why are you bringing politics into this? Yes, the Republican Party has completely ignored and rejected the science of climate change, and still does. And this isn't me trying to get someone to vote one way or another. It is a demonstrable fact that the Republican Party rejects the science of climate change, right? This is one reason they have as much success as they do. It's one reason why Donald Trump polls almost half of this country. So a large portion of those are people that do not want to talk about or address climate change. And as evidence, go Google and you can find, what's his butt, Governor Ron DeSantis passed a law removing climate change language from bills. The governor before him made it illegal for state employees to say climate change and put it in documents. When I was in San Antonio, the mayor, a Democrat, passed some sort of resolution that people would not use the phrase climate change in their documents. I can go on and on about this, right? But let me see, you can see. We always knew this was going to happen. Now it's happening, right? And is it catching people's attention to think about looking, and you should take some time and look at the devastation, particularly in Western North Carolina, and in ways that are hard to envision, but again, completely predicted in climate change science, right? And in fact, what I tell you is that for many years, this is an area in which the scientists failed and the liberal arts folks that are supposed to interpret the science failed, is that we sort of downplayed the predictions because you didn't want to scare people and scare them off. Well, that didn't work either, right? So let's talk about that a little bit. I'll also flag too for you that I published a book called Finding the River, an Environmental History of the Elwha. It was a finalist for the Washington State Book Award, so I'm proud of it. It's a long environmental history of the Elwha River in Washington State, which is the first river where legislation was passed at a federal level to remove the dams in order to store the salmon. And it's been a monumental success, and it is, in many ways, the model for the Klamath River restoration, which is an amazing thing and also much more complicated. And my reviews were very good, excellent reviews for my book. But every single one of them had to say one little thing, and it's because I ended my chapter. So it's called Finding the River. I'm an REM fan, so you can see the gray. But REM, 80s rock, college rock stations, right? REM is all about REM, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Butthole Surfers, all these great bands. And Find the River is a song by them that I love, But also, too, I was doing like a postmodern thing. And what I'm saying is finding the river is like finding the river in terms of its meaning to the culture of the people that use it. So the Elwha River, for the Lower Elwha Sklallam Indians who lived there for thousands of years sustainably, meant one thing, right? It was the basis of their culture. They called themselves the strong people. Sklallam were strong people. And the Elwha was the cultural and resource basis of all of that, and religious as well, right? So I won't do a whole thing on salmon and native peoples because it's one of my areas. I can do it, but and then when white people came in, and pushed the Elwha Sklallam off their land and cut down the forests and converted the grasslands to agricultural fields, and then built dams to create hydroelectricity for factories, the river was something different to them. It meant something different to them. It meant consolidated capitalism, right? Consolidated capitalism, which is being fueled by electricity generated by the dams and the turbines, right? So it was one of the earliest dams in the hydroelectric era of the 20th century, right? Then we got the big dams like the Grand Coulee Dam and the Hoover Dam and dams like that. And then later on, when you get into the 60s and 70s, fish conservationists trying to figure out solutions, the Elwha starts to mean something else because it still has this native breeding stock and all this. And then when the environmentalists and the Lower Elwha Sklallam started looking at removing the dams in the 70s, and particularly in the 80s and 90s, which, by the way, you all are living in an era in which dam removal is kind of common. Well, I'm telling you folks, when they started this stuff, it was radical, just completely radical, crazy, revolutionary, Marxist nonsense, right? This is what people said to me. I got yelled "fuck off" at a public hearing in Lewiston, Idaho, when we were talking about trying to remove the dams on the Lower Snake River. I'm just going to go ahead and flag because I know there's the faculty who. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. I have done my activism. I've done a ton of activism. So yeah, I got mean things were said to me when I argued for removing the dams in the Lower Snake River back in 1994, right? So anyways, where was I? Babbling. So for the Lower Elwha Sklallam and the environmental activists that worked with them and then led the effort to remove the dams, the LWA became a different thing. It had a different meaning, which was this is a place where we can achieve restoration and we can achieve something sort of unprecedented in the history of environmental activism. And so my last chapter was, well, okay, in the era of climate change, the book was published in 2011, what does the LWA mean? Right? So they've achieved this remarkable restoration. It's going to do all these great things. You know, the nearshore environment's going to improve. We're going to get eelgrass back. We're going to have smelt and sand lance, and the Dungeness crab's going to return, and all that. And we'll have more raccoons and bears because we'll have more salmon. We'll have more nutrients in the soil. And then, bam, the glaciers are disappearing in the Olympic Mountains. That's where the LWA is, Olympic Peninsula, Washington State, right? What does that mean? What does a restored LWA river mean in that context? And what I argued was that one of our strategies can be like Noah's Ark's rivers. I know, using Judeo-Christian model, traditionally native space. It's 2011, I've evolved since then. But, you know, essentially let's call it like a proposal from the early 20th century, interestingly enough, was like river parks, where you just protect these entire river ecosystems and try to, as best you can, protect the native genetic stock. Right? Until, and my hopes are decreasing, until we get to a better space and then we can restore salmon runs, right? And every review had to say like one little snarky thing about that. And I will tell you one other thing. There was a professor, someone I know, who had such a little tizzy fit that I, as a historian, was not objective. And then I engaged in some advocacy in my last chapter that he decided to take me down in his class and then had his students write critiques of me talking about climate change in my last chapter, and then sent those to me like I could give a shit, right? So anyways, what I'm saying to you is a few things. One is, we've been talking about climate change for a long time. We've been projecting the impact of climate change. Hurricane Helene is in no way a surprise. And yet we have not, as a society, built the resilience. And I don't just mean mitigation adaptation, I mean resilience, like food stocks, transportation systems, federal agencies and state agencies that have the budget and capacity to address these issues. We have not done that work, right? And this is the work we all have to do. This is the burden that my generation, older generation, has dumped on you all. This is what you'll be spending a lot of your lives doing, is addressing this mounting crisis, right? So I do have a tendency to move towards doomsayer mode. I apologize for that, but you know, again, follow the news, look at what I'm looking at, read what I'm reading. So that's part of it. And then the other piece too, and this is where I might start to sound a little mean, but I watch these hurricanes form, and they're always, they're headed towards red states. So I'm going to go ahead and say it. These are states that have consistently voted for Republican senators and Republican presidents who've done everything they can to block and undermine any efforts to mitigate and deal with climate change. Now, I'll be the first to admit that, and I write about it in my textbook, actually, what a lousy job Clinton and Gore did on climate change. They talked about it. Rhetorically, they used it. They did almost nothing, right? Obama didn't do much more. But that's different than, the party that says it doesn't exist. It's not real. It's a liberal hoax. And this is Marxism masking as an environmental issue. That's the kind of has been the argument of the Republican Party, right? So for me, there's a deep irony when I see these red states that are about to get hammered by a hurricane, and then again, this hurricane and tropical storm roll through all these red states that are devastated and now also need massive federal aid, right? So vote for politicians who will block any efforts to build the resources needed to address the issue ahead of time. On the back end, ask for, demand the aid, and appropriately. We need to provide that aid. We need to provide that assistance. But the notion of someone like Ron DeSantis turning to the federal government saying, you have to help us, after calling everything that Biden does communism and socialism, is enough to make me, vomit, right? Because again, I'm not saying it's wrong to be a Republican. I'm not saying you should be a Democrat. I'm talking about pure fucking hypocrisy when it comes to these issues. The thing is, though, the thing that should sort of mediate any sort of the word, I'm forgetting the word. I have these long days, I get really tired. The German word Schadenfreude, meaning taking pleasure from someone else's pain. Leave it to the Germans to have a word about taking pleasure from someone else's pain. Schadenfreude. You don't want to feel that, right? Because in reality, the people that are suffering the most are the ones that are the most vulnerable and least able to manage these sorts of impacts, and also have the least political representation. The reality is, although they won't admit it, is that Republicans with money are buying up property in areas outside of the areas being most affected by climate change. There's a massive migration of capital into places like the Northwest, Northern California, the Upper Great Lakes region, Maine, as they look for their exit route, even while denying the sort of needs, regulation, taxes, mitigation that needs to be done to address climate change. So there's that. So there's all these social and economic impacts, and it's hard to work through all of these impacts of climate change. You look at something like, we had Katrina, but I think back then they're like, we're not sure this is a climate change hurricane, but it's bad and we dealt with it badly. But one thing we did see was a massive displacement of population and then a rebuilding of communities in a way that marginalized the traditional African American community, right? And then the environmental impact. So that's what we'll see here too, is the environmental devastation, the economic devastation, the need to find the money to engage in rebuilding roads, rebuilding bridges, rebuilding communities, finding homes for people, and then the out-migration of those folks into other areas, and then the impact on those communities, right? So what does that mean for us in a sustainable food system course? You're gonna bring it home, right? This isn't just an excuse for me to rant at you. It means when we think about sustainable food systems, we have a responsibility and I think an opportunity to talk about what that looks like in terms of climate change. And when I say, again, climate change / climate chaos, right? So a lot of people around here like to say, this is a pretty good place to ride out climate change, right? The record high in Eureka is 89 degrees. I was in Washington State 4 summers ago. We had the heat dome that reached 113 degrees, and Washington State, where we are, doesn't have a lot of air conditioning. So people died, right? So we have impacts here, but in terms of like weather extremes, not as much. Sea rise is an issue. But we're also a place that people are going to look and say, that's a place you can migrate to, right? And I think over time we'll see increased migration into the region. Some of that will be, again, moneyed elites, right? Vineyards are looking for properties in this region because it's drying out here, so it's becoming more amenable to wine production, which I would argue it's more important to put land into production for food than wine. I mean, I enjoy wine, right? But feeding people is more important than getting your buzz on. But then also displaced populations are going to be looking for places to go. So, but there's also to our own vulnerability. We, a big storm and we were like 2 winters ago completely cut off north and south for at least a couple of days. We had those weird snowstorms, earthquakes, snowstorms, other sort of climate change impacts, fires. So we have to think about models, and so I'm talking about here, but we're talking about models that all communities could be thinking about, is how to be food sovereign and to have a sustainable food infrastructure in their communities. And within, I think, 3 days of this crisis from Hurricane Helene, people were running out of food, right? Now, again, I mean, I don't can, so I'm not canning preserves. So I have a lot of stuff in my refrigerator and closet. So, but if my house were washed away, I would be in the same situation as anyone else, right? But how, as a society, do you build out both local food production systems and then food hubs and then food storage and food distribution systems? That means when a crisis arrives, you're not immediately pushed to the very brink that you have. It's like, okay, yeah, we lost our water, we lost our electricity, no cell phone coverage, but I got a lot of apples here. We've got milk, we have local beef. We know we can feed people as we work our way through our crisis. So climate change is so much more than all of that. But then the way we deal with climate change is to look at the pieces and say, what's the piece I can address? Where is a structural element that I can be part of building a solution for, or as part of, right? I'm sorry, I'm losing my words there a little bit. And so then that becomes part of local resilience. Like, and what we have is we have some like Dr. Erin Gregory over in Native Studies Engineering is doing great work on energy sovereignty, or like with the Blue Lake Rancheria, right, with her own microgrids. And we have a microgrid. And I know you don't hear about it as much because we talk about housing all the time, but we are actually going to do so much solar for Cal Poly Humboldt that on good days we will not only have enough electricity for the entire university, but also distribute to the community. Those are all elements of resilience, right? So I'll say one other thing too, which is that, you know, when people looked at the recession of 2008 and then the COVID pandemic and its impacts, and people did a great job with that. The thing I tried to, you know, I comment in different ways on different people's stuff. I try to find something in there that I can speak to a little bit. You know, I think of it as like a little conversation between you and I. Is that, you know, every time something happens like that, everything comes crumbling down. It's like a major crisis because we don't have a safety net. We have such a limited safety net compared to other countries. You know, I mean, you know, food distribution systems, food stamps or SNAP, extended unemployment benefits, right? We just don't have that. And so everything becomes a crisis right away that then you have to manufacture a bunch of solutions for. And then as what happened with COVID, massive amounts of waste and maldistribution of resources to the wealthy. A lot of that money went to corporations and the wealthy, which they then used to like buy back stock to make themselves more wealthy, right? Because that's America. So as you think about sustainable food systems, as you think about your story of a meal, think about the way we as a community, and whatever community you're from and you're going back to, can build out sovereign, independent food systems that are resilient to not only be ready for whatever might challenge us, right, here in the place we are or wherever it is you end up, but also to be able to lend support to other places when they're struggling, because that's also going to be necessary. So thanks for coming to my TED Talk, and I hope you're all doing well.